Mary Ann Clark, who is the heroine or the villain, if according to some people at the time of the piece, was born in 1797 in Norfolk. Coming forward, John Glass, who was Roger and his sister's cousin, became the rector of Burnham Westgate, and he married Anna Maria Martin, and they settled in the house in which the Martins had grown up, and he remains there till his death some years later. Now, one of the other interesting aspects around this and around the issue of duelling and why Roger Martin might have been felt that he should call out the curate for a duel was that their close family friend, Lady Camelford, had a son called Thomas Pitt, who was the second Lord Camelford, and he was quite notorious for lots of different reasons. And he was known for having fought several duels. And he died in 1804, around the time that John Glass became rector of Burnham Westgate, from wounds that he suffered while fighting a duel, which was to defend the honour of his lady friend. Now, he was a few years older than Roger Martin. They were very close friends. There's no doubt that Roger knew a lot about this episode. Whether or not that affected him or influenced him in any way, we can only speculate. But it's an interesting piece of background context to look at. And as I say, the marriage occurs not long after between those two cousins. We also have lots of other things start to happen in this period. Despite the fact that the Glass family were also quite wealthy, John Glass was going through a lot of financial difficulties. So were some of his relatives. His cousin, one of his cousins, called George, who was also a vicar, committed suicide in 1809. Because he was worried about the scandal that was going to occur over debts and over his impending bankruptcy. And then the next key thing that occurs is that Horatia Nelson, the illegitimate daughter of Horatio, moved next door to the Glass family in Burnham Westgate with Lord Nelson's sister, who had married by that time and was living next door to Anna Maria and John Glass. And she became very close with the Glass family. And when she later married, a few years later, she married John Glass's curate and actually lived with John and Anna Maria for 2 or 3 years before moving to another part of the country. So she was very closely involved. One of the interesting things about this is that nobody seemed to treat her in any disparaging way. She was illegitimate. It was a well-known secret that she was the real child of Horatio Nelson and Emma Hamilton. And yet she seems to have been welcomed with open arms. She took part in all the sorts of social activities you would expect for a young gentlewoman, probably helped by the fact that there were still members of the Nelson family living close by. But she doesn't seem to have attracted any kind of criticism for her background by local people. And then coming forward to set the scene as to why Roger Martin might have felt the need to make some kind of public declaration, some kind of public statement about this woman who shared his home overtly as his housekeeper, we start to see the first clues appearing in around 1818 when the Reverend John Glass tried to borrow money. Now, he actually tried to borrow money from someone he didn't know at all, another gentleman, Anthony Hammond. Such kind of approaches weren't that unusual. At this time, there weren't that many banks or ways in which you could borrow money. So people borrowing off other people, individuals, was quite well known. And there was usually something in it for that person that was doing the lending. So he wrote a letter, which is at Norfolk Record Office. And he said, I feel that a pecuniary transaction is managed with the least awkwardness between persons who are not in those habits of intimacy which commonly excite feelings of delicacy on both sides. Now, Anthony Hammond turned him down. He actually wrote a note on the back, because this letter is among the Hammond papers, seemingly quite surprised at the approach. But the letter also explained that John Glass had got into trouble through investing with somebody else who had then committed fraud and possibly committed fraud and had gone bankrupt. But at the same time as this, John's own father, who unfortunately, as is often the case in families, was also called John and was also a vicar, was in legal dispute with his stepson. So his father was Anna Maria's uncle, who had by marriage, who'd married her aunt on her mother's side. Her aunt had died, and then the elder John Glass had remarried a wealthy widow who had 2 grown-up children. And there was a major dispute over in the second wife's inheritance and assets, and which went on for years. And the younger John Glass was caught up in this. So it undoubtedly had some kind of effect on him. He had to make declarations at court and appear as a witness, and it went on for years and years. So this is all going on in the background. Excuse me. And then we find more evidence of John Glass suffering financial problems, and various other things come about. One of the things that gets referenced in this biography of Horatio Nelson is that he, and I found a copy of a letter in which it's referred to as well. He actually he was one of the trustees of her trust fund, which was left by Horatio Nelson and other money contributed by other members of the Nelson family. And he borrowed from that trust money with her permission. But he tried to again a second time, and they were less keen on lending it to him a second time. They were very worried he would not be able to do so, to be able to pay it back. So for various reasons, he was enduring more and more financial problems. And in 1822, as I say, Horatio Nelson lived with the family for a year or 2 after her marriage. Now, the main evidence about what might have caused the event in 1836 goes back to the death of Reverend John Glass in 1831, and it's referenced in this biography of Horatio. Now, Roger Martin returned from India in 1828. He'd gone there in 1795. As far as I know, he's never came back in between. And one of the very interesting little snippets that appears in the diary of Elizabeth Jones née Helsham was that she said, ere long, all was sadness and sorrow. And she talks about how his sisters, when one of his sisters would have liked to have seen him to get married, I believe this was Anna Maria, but the others were against it. Now, one of the questions you might ask yourself is why? He was a bachelor, he was a baronet, he had a big estate, he had a reasonable career in India, he wasn't short of money, he was a good catch, and he was certainly getting on a bit by this point in some ways, and he was still single. So it was suggested by Elizabeth Helsham and by other people commenting, including another clergyman who knew the family, Reverend Crowe, that the other sisters felt that their sons would lose out, that they hoped one of their sons would inherit, or their sons between them would inherit the Burnham estate, and that if Roger then was to get married, obviously they would lose out. And I say the elder John Glass, the father and father-in-law of Anna, John and Anna, died in 1830, and that legal dispute was still really going on at this time. Then in 1831, Reverend John Glass died, and as Reverend Gunn wrote to Reverend Crowe, he used the phrase, "Glass dies embarrassed." And that means, of course, that he was still in financial difficulties. There are very strong indications reading between the lines that he committed suicide, as his own cousin had done so some years before, due to, and probably partly due to the pressure of these financial problems. And these two vicars write to each other 2 or 3 times, referencing his financial problems and his inability to cope with some of the sort of administrative responsibilities he had as being executor for his father and other relatives. So coming back to Horatia and why and how this might have led to this event in 1836, why did he commit suicide? My evidence, the research I've done, definitely shows that he was suffering from financial problems, and this was a major part of it, and that some of his contemporaries had no doubt that played a part in what he did. But in the biography of Horatio Nelson, the author, Winifred Guerin, writes a scene in which Roger Martin had been having a relationship with an improper relationship with Mary Ann Clark and refused to give her up. And this was causing scandal for the family. And that Reverend John Glass went to see him in 1831 and begged his cousin and brother-in-law to give up Mary Ann Clark, and Roger Martin refused to do so. And as a result of that, John Glass came home and committed suicide. There is no other account of this, and sadly, as I said, the biography does not give a source for this story. I think there's a hint that it could have contributed to it in Elizabeth Helsham's statement that ere long all was sadness and sorrow. There was obviously other factors going on as well, and I doubt very much it was the only reason. Not least because his other contemporaries, his fellow clergymen, were talking about his financial problems directly in relation to his suicide, but also because why would he be so distraught over his cousin and brother-in-law having a mistress when he had no problem with Horatio Nelson, who lived next door and lived with his family? And obviously had no problems with the fact with Horatio Nelson having fathered her. And so there's a lot of questions there about how true this could be. But it also brings up something that happens a lot in family histories, which is the family stories. Many of us have family stories that get passed down. They might even have got written down and passed on, and they become a truth. They become a fact. But there are a lot of reasons why I think we can say that this isn't the whole picture, because the other factor in this is if Roger Martin really had been the cause of John Glass feeling so distraught that he had to go and kill himself, why then did Roger Martin leave a large amount of his estate to John's son, and why in 1836, when Roger Martin challenged the curate to a duel, did the same nephew, Bulkley Glass, act as his messenger, relaying those letters to and fro between those 3 men, and was prepared to be his second should the duel take place. So I don't think if Roger had been considered to be completely responsible or directly responsible for his father's death, that Bulkley Glass would have done that. So, but it raises some questions. So coming back to Roger Martin and Mary Ann Clark, and why in 1836 would Roger do what he did? Well, it's evident from the broadsheets, from what he said about being ostracized, by not being accepted by his female relatives, that they wouldn't have anything to do with her, that he felt the need to make some kind of statement. We cannot ever know what triggered it on that particular day, but it is 5 years after the death of his cousin and brother-in-law, and I suspect in that time there have been rumours, there have been whispers, and things have been said, and something triggered it for him to take her to the church that day. So what I think may have triggered it was Ellen Clark turning up or being brought to live with the family, or evidence of her existence being brought to people's attention. Now, Ellen Clark is never ever described as the daughter of Roger and Mary Ann. In fact, according to all the official records, she was the daughter of Mary Ann's brother and John Cadge Clark and his wife Elizabeth Clark. And there's varying discrepancies over Ellen's age. I first found any record of her on the 1851 census. She cannot be found on the 41 census anywhere at all, although Mary Ann and Roger can. They were still living at the Hall, and she's always described as his housekeeper. The death notice of Elizabeth Clark appears in 1827 in the Norfolk Chronicle, and there and she was buried, and her burial occurred. It took me a long time to find the baptism of Ellen, this reputed ward niece, adopted daughter, and she appears in a little village. Various records say she was born in Scotto or in Burnham Westgate. She doesn't appear in any of those parishes. I eventually found her baptised at Lammas with Little Hobbis in 1833. And there's a little note in the underneath her baptismal entry, which said she was born on the 17th of August, 1827, to John Cadge and Elizabeth Clark. The problem with that is that Elizabeth had died 6 months before. John doesn't die to the following year, but he never remarried. There's no record in their death notices, obituaries, or any other records, wills of family members of him having any children. But other records always describe Ellen as his daughter, and that Mary Ann adopted her. So what we have, as I say, various discrepancies. So if we look at the timeline, Elizabeth, the wife and supposed mother of Ellen, dies in March 1827. According to that baptism, Ellen was born in 1827 in August, but other records show her as born a year or two later. And I suspect that's the actual truth of it, that she was born 1 or 2 years later, after Sir Roger Martin returns from India. And that's what leads up to the confrontation between him and his brother-in-law, possibly, but certainly her presence probably led to this confrontation in the church. And all the other records show her approximate date of birth as between 1828 and 31. And the vicar would have no reason to question it, the birth date given. She was 3 or 4 years old at this time. They would just accept it unless they had a reason to dispute it in some way. At some point around this time, of course, Mary Ann became housekeeper to Sir Roger Martin. So in the run-up to this confrontation in 1836, if you look at the broader context of what was going on in England, it's quite a disruptive time. There have been lots of protests, both for and against the Reform Bill, which was passed in 1832. Many people were very concerned because there were agricultural riots, machine breaking. They were worried about the old order of things breaking down. It's within living memory of the French Revolution, and there were very real concerns there could be a revolution here. And at the same time, we've got conflict going on in the background locally. There was a very famous or infamous murder trial in Burnham Westgate the year before in 1835, which involved adultery, poisoning, and accusations of witchcraft. Now, when you see accusations of witchcraft and belief in those things, and this belief was still quite prevalent, it often is a reflection of some wider kind of conflict going on in a community. The most infamous witch trials, of course, occurred during the conflicts and disruptions of the 17th century. And it's not unreasonable to see that there's something rotten going on in the kingdom of Burnham Westgate around this time. And it made the national papers, this event. And then only a few months later, Sir Roger takes his lady friend, Sir Mary Ann Clarke, to the church in a open way of it's obviously making some kind of public statement. To walk her down that aisle and sit her in the family pew was him saying, I don't care what you think. And he's making some kind of statement. And what Reverend Bernard Gilpin had to say, and these are the broadsheets here in full, he said, in response, when he stood up for his curate, he said, this is a situation reserved by decency and propriety for the pride and ornament of domestic life. You must not be surprised that I publicly appeal to my parishioners, both in vindication of my own conduct and to guard them from the influence of so dangerous an example. It was breaking down social order. It was rocking the status quo. So what were the consequences? Well, we don't exactly know what all the consequences were. There's no doubt that Bernard Gilpin and Henry Everidge Bligh, until their deaths, were still involved in many of the same things that Sir Roger Martin was. They certainly appear in newspaper reports at public events at the same time. But we don't get any glimpse of what's going on with Mary Ann Clarke. Her family background was much, much more lowly. I mean, her father was a small farmer. He did leave a will. She was obviously educated because she could write, but her brothers were stewards and farm servants and bailiffs and that kind of social level. She was not of the same social class as Roger Martin, which might be the answer to why they never married, because there was no obstacles to them getting married, not legally anyway. They were both single. But they never did get married. They remained living together in that hall. He continued to be involved in agricultural projects. He became famous for his opium that he grew on a piece of land nearby. And he attended many of the big social events. Her name does not appear at any of those events. When he died his sister died in 1853. By this time, she moved away from Burnham Westgate after her husband's death, but her son, Bulkley, remained in close contact with his uncle, and her body was brought back to be buried with her husband in the parish churchyard. So despite the fact he committed suicide, he was buried in the churchyard. There's no mention of suicide on his burial record. Perhaps not surprisingly, they weren't going to be very overt about that. So Roger died the year later, and he left the estate in trust to that nephew with a life interest to Mary Ann Clark. When Ellen married 2 years later, she was described as the only child of John Cadge Clark and the adopted daughter of Sir Roger. In his will, he described her as his ward. Mary Ann Clark died in 1888, and she left her estate to her adopted daughter, Ellen, which was worth £20,000 then, over £2 million today. And Ellen became Lady of the Manor and she died in 1893. Now, one of the interesting things that also came out when Roger died is that his other nephews, of the sisters that had obviously ostracized him, were called to his deathbed. And Mordaunt, who was named after Roger's father, wrote to one of his cousins about the fact that Roger had supposedly promised a bequest to this cousin, but it somehow did not appear in the final will or codicil as Roger had asked on his deathbed. And Mordaunt, who was also a vicar, used this phrase when writing about Mary Ann and his visit, and he obviously detested her. And he said, I would rescue him from such a foul hand if I could. So obviously still some very strong feelings about her and her relationship with Roger. Yet after Roger's death, we start to see references to Mary Ann. She gets referred to as the Lady of the Manor in newspaper reports. She obviously sort of becomes rehabilitated in a way, either through the passage of time that many of the main characters had died off, or simply because she was held that estate in trust and was a very wealthy woman in her own right by this point. And one of the interesting things about her will, and this is where we have to dig deeper in our family history research and think about how we interpret things like bequests, is that she left lots of little bequests to all her nieces and nephews. Every single one of them, she described who the parents were of those nieces and nephews. Yet when it came to Ellen, her supposed adopted niece, the supposed daughter of her deceased brother John, she only referred to her as Ellen Clark. She never mentioned who Ellen's parents were in her will, which of course is a legal document, so she may not have wanted to lie outrightly. So that kind of brings us to the end. And I'm just going to finish with the last bit from my book, because although there's no official evidence that this couple were a couple, or the parents of Ellen, there's plenty of evidence we can string together to say that was the case. They were buried together in this gravestone by the churchyard wall, and their home is on the other side of that wall. And this is the memorial stone to the pair of them buried together in death. And my final bit that I wrote is, I like to think that he and Mary Ann Clark continued going to church, sitting together in the family pew, with the Martin crest on the wall above their heads, the memorial to John and Anna Maria Glass to one side, and within feet of the brass-plated and marble monuments to Roger's parents and other relations. That finally others shared in Roger Martin's belief that Mary Ann Clark was kind, generous, and truly virtuous. Thank you.